Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I apologize again for it being such a while since I last posted. Yes, I did have another child. I now have a 3-year-old girl and a 1-year-old boy. And I made this quilt for all of us to snuggle up with on the couch and watch Halloween movies together. Yes, making a quilt does take a lot of patience, but having this beautiful blanket that will last forever and make memories with is totally worth it. Don't forget to check out the other videos that I posted today. Let's get started. First of all, to make a quilt, you're going to need fabric. I've been collecting this Nightmare Before Christmas fabric. They are quite expensive, so I'm also using some generic Halloween fabric. Each of these fabric sizes are 18 by 22 inches, which is called a fat quarter. The quilt I'm making is absolutely enormous and I'm using 17 different fabrics. But if it's your first time making a quilt, I recommend making it smaller. 9 fat quarters will be enough to make a baby quilt, and 12 fat quarters will be big enough to make a quilt that fits over your lap. To cut your fabric, you need a rotary cutter, a ruler, and a cutting mat. I'm going to cut the fat quarter into strips which are 4.5 inches wide. After cutting all the strips, you'll find that there's a thinner piece on the end. You can put this aside and keep it for a future project. I then cut each strip into squares. Once I cut out all my fabric into squares, I'm going to lay it out onto a large surface in the pattern that I want. Once I'm happy with my pattern, I'm going to take the first 2 squares and sew them together. I'm sewing them together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. The 1/4 inch line will be marked on your sewing machine. Once you've sewed the 2 squares together, do the same for the rest of the line. You can then sew all the pairs together to make one long strip. You can then sew the strips together, always using that 1/4 inch seam. As you can see here, I haven't done well at all. The lines aren't very well joined up. I admit this is probably the hardest part of doing a quilt for me. I find that ironing the strip first before sewing it together helps a lot, and then just really taking care of making sure the squares are aligned as you sew. Now the strips are all sewn together, I now have a quilt top. A quilt consists of 3 layers: the quilt top, the batting in the middle, and the backing fabric. I'm using a plain white cotton fabric for the back. I'm going to lay them down on the floor all in order, and then using pins, just pinning everything together to hold it in place. You want the back fabric and the batting to be slightly larger than the quilt top, as the fabric moves around a bit as it goes through the sewing machine. Once all 3 layers are pinned together, I'm putting it through the sewing machine, sewing directly onto the lines of the squares. If you want, you can sew on either side of the lines as I have done here. There are endless ways of doing it. There's another way called free motion quilting, which you can see here on a quilt that my aunt has made for my daughter. Once you've finished sewing all the layers together, you can trim around the edges, leaving just a small bit of batting around the edges. And now for the final piece of fabric that you're going to need, which is for the binding. For the binding, I've chosen this striped fabric, which I've sewn into long strips, and then sew these long strips to the edge of the quilt. I'm actually going to put a link down below to a video tutorial from another YouTuber that describes this step-by-step process perfectly. It's got millions of views and it's just described much better than I ever could. It's not difficult at all, it just requires a few steps which deserves a video on its own. And that is my finished quilt. I'm really happy with how it turned out and I know my kids are going to love using it. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Thanks for watching. Cheers!